Well, hello and welcome everyone to another excellent webinar in our series from the EU Values Network, a collaborative Jean Monnet network aiming to create dialogue and broader understanding of the EU's normative values. My name is Emily Jones, your host and moderator. In today's webinar, we're delighted to welcome Professor Natasha Wunsch, who will be presenting insights from her new book on democratic commitment and the paradox of public tolerance for democratic backsliding. Professor Natasha Wunsch joined the University of Freiburg in 2023 as Professor of European Studies, where she also serves as Director of the Centre for European Studies and heads the MA programme in European Studies too. She previously held academic positions at Sciences Po Paris, ETH Zurich, and has been a visiting fellow at Harvard University and the University of Oxford. She acted as chair of the ECPR Standing Group on the European Union until 2024 and contributes her expertise to the German Council on Foreign Relations and the Institute for European Politics. Her research lies at the intersection of European and comparative politics, with a focus on democracy promotion, democratic backsliding, and the challenges facing liberal democracy in the post-communist space. She is currently leading a Swiss National Science Foundation project on citizens' democratic attitudes in Europe. Later, when we upload the recording of this session to our website and YouTube, we will pop in the description of this video everything I've just mentioned there. So do head there to have more information on Natasha's work, her research, and all of her activities. We're also really pleased to be joined by Professor Chris Claassen, Professor of Political Behaviour at the University of Glasgow, a leading scholar of public support for democracy, majority-minority relations, and survey methodology. His research has been published in the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, and Political Analysis. He is the recipient of the Philip Leverhulme Prize and served as UK Principal Investigator for the Nordface project titled A Rural-Urban Divide in Europe. Professor Claassen will offer expert reflections to situate today's findings within wider debates on democratic resilience and public attitudes in contemporary Europe. So together, Professor Wunsch and Professor Claassen will help us think about the conditions that are shaping citizens' responses to democratic erosion. Thank you both for being with us today. We're very excited to have you here. If you're watching live, you will have the opportunity towards the end to submit your questions in the Q&A that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. But throughout, if you have comments or thoughts or anything, just please note them there and you'll have your chance to speak with the experts. So without further ado, I will now hand over to our presenter for the session to hear about her latest book, Professor Natasha Wunsch. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily, for hosting this. And I'm just going to share my slides so that you can see what I'm talking about specifically. Here we go. So the content I wanted to share today is a very recently published book titled Democratic Commitment, Why Citizens Tolerate Democratic Backsliding. It's literally just out in October with Oxford University Press. It's also available open access, so you can download all of the chapters free of charge from the OUP website. And the question that I ask in this book, or the puzzle I address, is basically the question of, if citizens support democracy as broadly as we believe them to do from a lot of the survey research we have, why is it that they continue to endorse leaders that begin to backslide and to undermine democratic standards once they arrive in power? And so the question really is, why is it that citizens tolerate democratic backsliding when we would expect them to do otherwise? And there are two quite prominent explanations in the literature. One that focuses on partisan polarization. It's very much informed by the US context, this very bipolar context where partisan identities tend to run very deep. And some of the findings from this context tell us that it's really about a partisan double standard. Citizens are partisans first and Democrats second, and they will always give, or pretty systematically give, precedence to co-partisan loyalty over respect for democracy. Another prominent explanation focuses on value or policy trade-offs, again with the assumption citizens do see and recognize the democratic transgressions are taking place, but they're going to value economic or cultural orientations of their preferred party or of a given candidate over their respect for democracy. And to this, I add with my book a third perspective that focuses more on political culture and more specifically understandings of democracy in the population, with the assumption that maybe it's not as clear-cut when it comes to support for democracy as we believe, and there are actually fundamentally divergent understandings of democracy in a given population, and that this lack of attitudinal consolidation around liberal democratic principles leads to citizens overlooking, neglecting, tolerating democratic transgressions by elected leaders. So the theoretical argument I formulate in the book really starts from this premise that there are these fundamentally different understandings of democracy that translate into different degrees of democratic commitment, and that this in turn shapes vote choice in these contexts when faced with leaders who are undermining democratic norms. There's a demand and a supply side to this argument. On the demand side, I expect citizens to have some degree of pre-existing beliefs about democracy, although not necessarily fully formed. And on the supply side, I expect elites to actively seek to shape these beliefs that citizens hold and therefore also influence their understandings of democracy by making kind of appeals that would try to make their actions seem less undemocratic in the eyes of citizens. So the theoretical argument I make really proceeds in 3 steps, and these map onto the empirical chapters of the book. On the one hand, there's the demand side. So I expect commitment to liberal democracy to remain uneven among citizens, and for this to make part of the electorate less willing to punish transgressions of liberal democratic principles by elected persons. And on the supply side, I expect political elites to deliberately seek to mobilize these kind of alternative understandings of democracy in order to secure ongoing electoral support, although they actively and often relatively visibly engage in democratic transgressions. And so ultimately, where the two of these come together, I expect citizens with a lower commitment to liberal democratic principles to be less likely to punish transgressions and more likely to kind of overlook them in electoral contexts. I look at this in 2 specific countries, 2 countries in which democratic backsliding has taken place to different degrees. So basically the 2 most prominent instances of democratic backsliding in Europe, in Hungary, under Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party since 2010, and in Poland under the Law and Justice Party, PiS, since 2015. Although, and we can maybe speak about this in the Q&A later, in October 2023 there was a turnover there, and the former opposition party gained we came back into government. So first of all, of course, how would we measure commitment to liberal democracy? And there's quite a wide-spanning literature on how important mass support for democracy is to both the consolidation of democracy, but also its ongoing stability. But when it comes to measurement, most cross-national surveys tend to measure more of a nominal support for democracy. So in the World Values Survey, we have democracy alongside alternative forms of government as a kind of a Churchillian item where it's about democracy being better than other systems. In the European Social Survey, there's a battery of different understandings, but they also have a question on the importance of living in a democracy, scaled from 1 to 10, but with the assumption also by the developers of this battery that you would need to put the cutoff at 10 in order to make sense of it. And we also have actually Chris himself, so I'm very happy that you're here today, Chris, to discuss my book, who recently, with a lot of co-authors, engaged in quite a big effort to try and tease out what might be liberal items of democracy that citizens can agree on transnationally. And I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit more about that in his discussion. But what we often see in these cross-national measures is that there's relatively little variation in the level of overall support, mass support for democracy, although we know that, of course, there are high levels of variation in the quality of democracy in different political systems across the world. And so what I propose in this book is a composite measure that assesses support for liberal democratic principles alongside alternative conceptions of democracy, and basically surmises that it's only when you very clearly value liberal principles highly in your conception of democracy and alternative views as less salient that we can really consider you to be a full-fledged liberal democrat. So there needs to be some degree of kind of trade-off and multidimensionality in this approach. And the 4 conceptions of democracy that I integrate into my measurement are, on the one hand, kind of the classical liberal conception that we as researchers often tend to think about when we think about citizen support for democracy or mass support for democracy. The liberal conception, where the emphasis is really on equal rights, executive constraints, democracy functioning in a very procedural manner. I add to this a redistributive conception where the emphasis is more on the outcomes of democracy, so the delivery of public goods, social welfare benefits, things of this kind of order. a majoritarian understanding where it's not just about majority rule, but really the idea that majorities need to prime over minority rights. And there's really a strong emphasis that majority backing of a government basically enables it to implement the political program it wishes without or overstepping occasionally executive constraints. And then finally, perhaps a somewhat counterintuitive authoritarian conception of democracy, where citizens will think that they are supporting or will declare to support democracy, but ultimately are really more in favor of strong leadership and citizen obedience. And then what I do is I let respondents in both Poland and Hungary rate all of these items in my democracy battery, and then I bring these together and I identify via latent profile analysis 5 distinct groups of understandings of democracy that pan out identically across the 2 country contexts in which I look at this. The first group that you see here is the group that I qualify as strong liberals. So you see all the way over on the left, a very high, consistently high rating for the liberal dimension of democracy. A somewhat high, although considerably lower emphasis on redistributive items, which I would argue are not necessarily in contradiction because they really look at the outcomes as opposed to the input side of democracy as the liberal dimension does. And then we see relatively low scores for both the majoritarian and the authoritarian conception. Now, if we move to the weak liberals, we see again, and this is consistent with cross-national surveys, we know very high ratings for the liberal dimension. But here we see that not only the redistributive dimension rates highly on average, but also the majoritarian dimension. So here we have something that's more directly in conflict with the executive constraints that liberal democracy emphasizes by granting this extra leeway to governments that enjoy the backing of an electoral majority. We see, though, here that authoritarian conceptions are still pretty low, so they are liberal, but somewhat more weakly so because this is a bit in tension with some other expectations that this group of respondents has towards democracy. A third group rates pretty highly across all 4 dimensions, again, most consistently, and we see this kind of natural skewedness of support for liberal democratic items on the liberal dimension, but again, across the others too. So I qualify these as ambivalent. They tend to see a lot of things as being an important part of democracy and not to value liberal democratic items as exclusively or as more important than anything else. Then there's a fourth group that I qualify as indifferent respondents. So here we see that already on the liberal dimension, it's considerably lower than for the other 3 types. So we're here more situated around the little bit above the midway of the 7-point scale. And we see that there's a lot of spread for the other 3 dimensions. So it's much less consistent there, but on average, they're also kind of midway across the scale. So this seems to be a group of respondents that struggle to pinpoint what exactly democracy means to them and what exactly should be part of a democracy. And then a final group, here we see actually very low levels and also consistently low levels. We see that the scores for the liberal dimension are the ones that tend to group most clearly for here around the average. So they're low on the liberal dimension. They're also low on the redistributive dimension, somewhat higher on the majoritarian one, and then highest actually on the authoritarian one. Again, with some spread, but clearly very distinct from the other profiles when it comes to how important the liberal dimension is to these respondents. When we look how these different groups distribute in the 2 countries that I examined, in Hungary, there's a very strong majority, so almost 60% that are qualified as weak liberals, so those that value not only the liberal dimension, but also the redistributive and the majoritarian one. So thereby being somewhat open both to economic trade-offs, welfare benefits, but also to majoritarian appeals by governments. And in Poland, we see also a relatively sizable weak liberal group, but an even larger indifferent one. So the ones that really struggle to pinpoint what exactly democracy means to them. I followed up on this survey-based battery with some focus groups, and I just want to share kind of the overall findings from there, which is that there was a considerable gap between diffuse support for democracy, so what respondents would say when I asked them what democracy meant to them in the abstract, and very negative evaluations of democratic practice in the countries. And this divided a little bit between government supporters and opposition supporters. So the supporters of the incumbent backsliding government at the time, both of these sets of focus groups were conducted while the backsliders were in power. The government supporters sought to either shift blame to say, well, things aren't ideal, but it's really the opposition's fault. or to relativize the impact and to say, perhaps everything isn't going too well when it comes to independent judiciary or media freedom, but the government did deliver when it comes to economic benefits, housing credits, childcare, and so on. And for the opposition supporters, it was more about expressing a kind of broader sense of frustration with the democratic system and often also a loss of trust in all political parties. So it's not necessarily that they felt that their preferred party, the opposition party, would do a better job, but more a general feeling that politics isn't delivering, democracy is kind of struggling, and they were pretty disillusioned about this. In Poland in particular, I also found a strong majoritarian view among citizens, so where they would really say, even if I don't like it, so even the opposition supporters, the government is elected. While they're elected, they can do what they want. And if this means dismantling judicial independence, then this is also kind of part of their government program and should be considered legitimate and democratic, even if we disagree with it. Overall, there was a very passive view of citizens' role because, of course, I was interested in seeing what might motivate citizens to respond, to resist, and to oppose backsliding. And there was a much more pervasive sense of withdrawal from politics, and not this idea, even among those that I would qualify as more strong liberals, even there, a sense that any action that they could take as citizens would probably not change much about the situation on the ground. Now, moving to the supply side, my question there was how backsliding elites frame democracy perhaps in ways that would appeal directly to citizens and strengthen them, legitimize their alternative non-liberal views. And so what I did here is I engaged in a qualitative frame analysis of public speeches, so speeches, electoral speeches, press releases, anything that would be public facing, where I really looked whether the kinds of appeals that I had mapped for the demand side would also be present in government discourse. So redistributive appeals regarding equality, welfare, development, majoritarian appeals regarding kind of this majority-based conception, but also sovereignty, national sovereignty, which was particularly relevant regarding responses to perceived EU interference in the rule of law in the two countries, or outright illiberal appeals where the argument would often be that the domestic set of values is actually fundamentally not compatible with the kind of more Western, external, liberal conception, and that this was also entirely legitimate and had to be accepted, that citizens could hold these distinct views. Now, if we look into some more quantitative data from the V-Party Index from the VDEM Institute, we see that over time, and even before they, and from the moment basically they enter government, anti-pluralist discourse, which is something that VDEM measures across kind of 4 items of delegitimizing the opposition and similar. Anti-pluralist discourse really goes through the roof as Fidesz enters power and becomes ever more anti-pluralist over time. What's interesting in the Hungarian case too, you see this lighter blue-grayish line, the Jobbik, the former far-right party, that actually becomes less anti-pluralist over time as it's overtaken by Fidesz. And if we then look more concretely into the discourse from a more qualitative perspective, the main appeal really by Fidesz is this outspoken illiberal, or what they then later reframed as Christian democracy appeal, that really says liberal democracy is a different model. That's not what we're trying to achieve here. We want traditional families, we want stability, and we want illiberal or Christian democracy that is in outright conflict with the liberal democratic principles that the EU stands for. We see a similar situation also in Poland, a little bit less dramatic, but also very much the anti-pluralist discourse driven by PiS, by the Law and Justice Party, whereas the other parties are very flat, very neutral on this. Again, irrespective of incumbency, this is really a kind of a radicalization of PiS discourse over time. And here we see the appeals are much broader. So there was quite a sizable also emphasis on creating, on reaching out to the left behind. So all of the more redistributive benefits that PiS emphasized in its understanding of democracy, where they would also say things like democracy is ultimately about improving the conditions of life for citizens. So not about any kind of institutional procedural dimensions, but really about these economic outcomes. A strong pushback also against EU criticism that was more outspoken in Poland, arguably, than in Hungary. So with this strong emphasis on sovereignty and also on the illiberal dimension, quite a bit of insistence there. So overall, elite discourse really showed this analysis of elite discourse that Hungarian and Polish leaders sought to reframe democracy along two kind of basic lines. The first being a failure of liberal democracy to deliver on outcomes, so economic prosperity, but also this kind of cultural conservative appeal of protecting traditional values. Liberal democracy is not well suited to protect this, according to the backsliding leaders. But also limited input legitimacy because of the counter-majoritarian elements that liberal democracy contains and that basically prevent the government from implementing the majority rule. I found relatively few direct justifications of democratic transgression, so I was interested in seeing whether they would explicitly try to justify what they're doing. That wasn't so much the case. But instead, it really seemed more an effort to build a strong voter base around an alternative set of values that would withstand both the external and the domestic criticism of the backsliding actions that the governments were taking at the time. Now, finally, bringing the two together, I conducted two conjoint experiments with two colleagues. I'll focus here just on the Polish one. The idea was here to have candidates that would vary in the way they spoke about democracy, with a liberal, a majoritarian, and an authoritarian attribute, way of framing key elements of democracy, but also including cultural orientations, also in economic policy, and kind of age and gender for the greater plausibility of the profiles. And so very concretely, the two democratic items focus on judicial appointments and the role of public media. So two very kind of genuinely liberal democratic dimensions where the two candidates would present varying views along these lines. And when we look at the overall pattern, so the choice was between kind of two candidates for the National Assembly. We see that a lot of things seem to matter. So basically the first four, two democratic items, the cultural item where we spoke about abortion and the tax reform were very salient to voters. But when we plug into this with a subgroup analysis, the understandings of democracy, we see that very clearly the red dots, so the strong liberals, are the ones, as expected, who most strongly reward candidates who adopt liberal positions and most strongly punish those who express either majoritarian or authoritarian views. And this is very consistent and basically also declines with the relative support for or commitment to liberal democracy that I had identified in the different groups of understandings that I singled out previously on the demand side. Now, is this perhaps a question of partisan divides? If we look into this again, so the red dot is peace. We do see that peace supporters on average are less rewarding of the liberal items and less punishing of the authoritarian ones. But we see that a big divide there also happens at the cultural level. So both peace supporters and the blue dot that you see here that is kind of together with the peace dot with the very conservative Catholic Confederation are very much against candidates who adopt a liberal view of abortion and very much in favor of those that express a more restrictive view. Now, in the Polish conjoint, we also had partisanship of the candidates as an explicit element. And so one question is this maybe ultimately a question of partisan polarization, as we have seen repeatedly shown in the US context? But here you have the three panels side by side, the overall findings, the findings where there is no party overlap and where there is a party overlap. And as you can see, just basically from eyeballing these different figures, there is actually no significant difference based on whether or not a candidate is a co-partisan or not. So it's really about perceptions of democracy more than about this partisan dimension. So to summarize, there does seem to be a considerable heterogeneity in citizens' understandings of democracy that makes it hard for them both to recognize and then even more so to resist democratic transgressions by elected leaders, often also because this kind of resistance is seen as futile and they rather choose to withdraw from the political process at large and kind of lose hope over democracy in general as a political system, rather than really trying to stand up against the leaders that are backsliding. On the supply side, we see that elites explicitly appeal to alternative understandings of democracy, which can, over time, then lead to the kind of gradual erosion of democratic norms among citizens, especially, of course, in contexts where there is already a sizable amount of polarization. And so there's a perception that maybe arguments where the opposition appeals to democratic understandings are basically just kind of instrumental ways to try and push back against the government in power. And when it comes to the experimental findings, there's really pretty clear evidence that weak liberal democratic commitment is an enduring vulnerability to democratic subversion because it leads citizens to be much less, much more tolerant of transgressions and much less willing to punish those at the ballot box. So that ultimately, the book argues that political culture, and specifically the strength of liberal democratic commitment, informs political behavior in the form of vote choice in context of democratic backsliding. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natasha. It was great. Really interesting to hear about, and congratulations on the book. I especially appreciated your kind of clear explanation there using demand and supply of citizen support for democracy and through the case studies as well of Poland and Hungary. So thank you. I'd like to remind our audience here today that we will have a Q&A at the end of this session. At the bottom of your screens, you can see a Q&A function. So as we go, if you have thoughts, comments, questions and such, do pop them there. And we'll come to those in a moment. So now we will turn to our expert discussant with us today, Professor Chris Claassen, for his thoughts and reflections on the book. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you for inviting me, Natasha and Emily. It's a real pleasure to talk about this very important book. In fact, when I first heard that Natasha was publishing this book, I reached out to her some months ago to get an advance copied so that I could have a read and really understand it. So it's a pleasure to talk about it because I've looked through it a couple times now. So I guess just to kind of situate the book in the literature, classically political culture going back many decades now is often thought as sort of one of the main ways a society can resist the breakdown of democracy. And it's generally been assumed that culture matters, but probably I think it's fair to say the evidence base is not as strong. And it's to the extent that people have tried to link sort of culture and democracy, it's tended to be macro level, at the cultural level. So that was sort of until the era of backsliding, which, maybe 5, 6 years ago, um, the literature changed, and mainly through the work of Milan Svolik, who not only came up with a way of studying the micro foundations of backsliding, like what voters do, but also came up with a theory. And what he did is sort of using a conjoined experiment. He actually did it first in Venezuela, um, and to actually study the choices people made. Will they vote for and against democracy? And his theory is it's quite a simple one and a very powerful one, and that is self-interest overwhelms what he calls civic virtue, or trumps civic virtue, as he puts it quite cheekily. And self-interest can be that you're from the same party as a candidate, or you have a similar ideological position. So you think, well, actually, I kind of like that candidate, and oh, well, maybe they're not great on democracy, but I'll trade that off. And there's a literature now which shows that people do like democracy and they will vote for it, but these self-interest matters probably to a larger degree. Now, missing from all of this is political culture, and I think this is the big contribution of this book, right? It's either been neglected or actually dismissed, I would say, in this new literature on backsliding, where people kind of loosely look at one survey item and say, oh, well, look at that, no one cares about democracy anyway. And I don't think it's been taken seriously, and I think this book is the first real attempt to do so, and it's really great to see, and the evidence shows that political culture actually does matter. And Natasha's, I think that's the main contribution here. And in the political culture framework, you have to take measurements seriously and have to think carefully about what is the dimension of culture, and both of those are things Natasha does do in the book. We have a very careful consideration of understandings of democracy and multidimensional measures and novel survey items, batteries designed specifically to measure these understandings. And that's really how you have to do it. So fantastic to see. I also appreciated in this work the kind of multi-methods and the sort of looking at the supply side and the demand side. And, on the demand side, we got surveys, we got the focus groups, mass surveys, and then survey experiments as well. And then on the supply side is, obviously the sort of elite discourse, looking at what leaders are saying, which I really appreciate it. I mean, I tend to be more on the demand side, I suppose, in terms of what I study. But I think that's the sort of supply side and how, these leaders are justifying how they erode democracy is something that's probably been neglected a bit. And it was really interesting to kind of see it mapped out in that chapter. Um, and so, these different parts of the book really buttress and support each other. There's multiple methods looking at what citizens think, qualitative, quantitative, experimental, and then the work looking at what the elites are doing, which complements the approach very nicely. Um, for me, though, the methodologically, the use of the conjoint approach to study the effects of political culture, that's the real standout methodological contribution. And Natasha talked about that to some extent. And I think that's the way to go because it is, it's one of the big contributions made by Spalek was to show that this is a really great way to study the choices people make. Um, and, as Natasha's results clearly show, that political culture seems to matter and it does seem to mitigate people voting for autocratic leaders. Um, and it's actually an approach I am now using in my work after having read Natasha's book and obviously the paper as well, which she talked about. That's based on this work. Um, Having said that, I think there's a couple points where sort of have a slightly different position or maybe depart a bit from the arguments in the book. And maybe the biggest one is understanding of democracy. Does that mean commitment to democracy? And this, I think, is a key argument, but I'm not sure that it follows. So in the book, understanding of democracy is measured by asking people. There's several statements about liberal democracy or authoritarian democracy and so on, and asked how essential people consider these to be for democracy. Um, and this, there's now quite a big literature on understandings of democracy, and it's helped to complement and flesh out, how we as citizens and in different cultures understand democracy and what that means for democracy. But understanding a concept and being normatively committed to that concept aren't the same thing. So consider a fascist ideology. Now, as political scientists, if we went around the room, if we were in a room and said, who understands, fascism? Does this particular attribute correspond to fascism? I don't think we would find that the people who actually understand fascism are committed to fascism. And I think maybe the reverse, actually. Um, another example. So this reminds me of work by Ellis and Stimson looking at ideology in American politics. And they, classically in American politics, it's almost an identity, conservative or liberal. And what they show is they ask really about understandings of these concepts, and they show that one of the important features in America is that it, a number of people who identify as conservative don't actually understand what that means. Like they think more spending on schools is a conservative position. And so, one of the big findings of their book is that, people on the left is stronger on the issues in the US, but the right is stronger on the identity, the conservative identity. And I think it's that sort of notion of understanding has helped to flesh out that concept, but it's not the same as being committed to, say, the liberal or the conservative ideology. And to my mind, that's a huge issue that because the measures are understanding, but a lot of the conclusions and interpretation is about commitment, which to my mind says it's more of a normative commitment, support for a concept, which is, of course, something I've been working on as well. So I think this point also pertains then to how we understand, like, what's the mechanism going on here? Because if it's understanding of democracy, it may be that people who don't really understand it are actually kind of they do like democracy and they would maybe defend it, but they maybe get tricked by the leaders' rhetoric about majoritarian or the kind of instrumental side. On the other hand, if it's commitment to democracy, if their low level of understanding of liberal democracy, if that means they're not committed, I think that's a slightly different interpretation and maybe a slightly bleaker one. And that is, all the leaders' rhetoric doesn't really matter because they don't really like democracy in itself. So I think that there's an important interpretation in terms of the actual mechanism. I guess there was one other smaller point, a couple other, maybe less consequential point that I wanted to discuss, and that this idea of democratic understanding, the dimensionality of it, and there's some discussion about that there's a number of different groups in the public, and there's latent class analysis, and the data are sort of partialed into these different groups. But just looking at the patterns, it seems to me that it's almost a single dimension there. Most respondents seem to have, broadly speaking, a liberal understanding, either the strong liberals or weak liberals. Now, the weak liberals are most of them, but given survey data, which is noisy, and these are difficult concepts, most people have a liberal understanding. Then almost all of the remainder are just people who don't really know much about politics, or just are not really concentrating in the survey, which of course nowadays with online surveys this happens, right? So people whose opinions are all over the place. There's a lot of noise. Um, the number of people who actually oppose a liberal understanding, who have strongly non-liberal, is very small, surprisingly small. And so I just wonder if it's almost there's like a single dimension. It's sort of liberal, maybe people just low understanding, and then there's the actual anti-democrats. Um, I don't know that. I think in some of your other work, Natasha, in the BJPS paper, you developed this in a slightly different direction. Um, Yeah, and finally, again, coming to the analysis of the conjoint, which for me was one of the most consequential parts of the book. I think, there's certainly evidence that having a liberal understanding of democracy moderates these sort of reactions and makes people more likely to vote for a Democratic candidate. But the tough test is really to see, will it make them more likely to vote across party lines for a Democratic candidate? Because that's really what backsliding is. You don't usually get two candidates, one Democratic, one autocratic from one party. There'll be opposing parties, or against ideological positions. Like I think it was Poland, you had the abortion position. Would they actually vote for someone who expresses the opposing position to them, but is maybe more democratic? And I think that's the real test. That whether it's understanding of democracy or support for democracy, I think that's people who put forward this political culture point of view. I think we need to show that. But in sum, this is a very important book. I really enjoyed the use of the conjoint to show how political culture helps to moderate and maybe mitigate this voting for authoritarian candidates that we see in backsliding. I think this is going to be a key reference for in the study of backsliding, in the study of political culture, and certainly it's a work that I've been using in my research at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, for your insights there and the great review of the book as a superb contribution to political culture and the study of it as well. And very interesting questions, which we'll come to on the differences between of understanding and committing to ideologies. So Natasha, if you wish, you can take some time to respond to these reflections and the questions posed, and then we will come to the Q&A from the audience. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. This was extremely helpful. I'm glad you liked the book, of course, and I'm also very glad for kind of the additional comments you made. I'm actually embarking on a new project that just started at the beginning of the month that basically tries to extend the argument beyond the post-communist context, looking also into Western European countries. And so it's really helpful to kind of get some input on what the book does, what it doesn't do, and what may need to be justified better. So I'll take your points maybe more or less in order. So the first question I think you raise, this whether there might be a tension, a difference between understandings of democracy and commitment. So the way we measure the understandings is actually by asking, so the World Value Survey question, how important is it for you in a democracy, for a democracy too, and then we have the different items. So while that is not yet perhaps fully commitment. I think it is definitely more than understanding, right? It's not do you think democracy means, it's do you think it's important in a democracy for, and then for instance, the majoritarian items, for a majority to systematically overrule a minority, which I think is quite a strong statement, where if this is a position where you score highly, I would say that does indicate a lower commitment to liberal democratic norms. So it's about more than the support for the concept as a kind of intellectual abstract. It's really more about, do you think this is central for democracy to correspond to these different items? That being said, one thing that I would definitely consider for the follow-up project is expanding and maybe reframing some of the items that we chose. So I do think, and that brings me to my second point, I'm quite convinced that there needs to be a multidimensional measurement of democracy, because I think indeed, while we see that the liberal dimension is the one that drives the different groups, we also see that the first three groups score extremely highly on liberal democracy, which basically doesn't allow us to differentiate that behind that and besides that, there are very different views of the additional dimensions. And I think if you score very highly on liberal democracy, but at the same time you say, of course, free and fair elections are important and kind of executive constraints, but ultimately I also very strongly agree that it's important for a democracy for the majority to always overrule, for the minority to always submit. I do think this is something very different than looking just at the liberal battery. And I think that is one of the weaknesses. And I think we don't really know why. So is this because people truly think they're committed to liberal democratic norms, or is it because of in these surveys, we also have, of course, a degree of social desirability. So bar any trade-off, if I ask an average respondent, do you think free and fair elections are a good thing? It would be quite surprising to see them score, let's say, below 8 on a 10-point scale. So I do think kind of it's by adding those different dimensions, even though I agree there's more spread there. So in a sense, I was happy that the groups were primarily differentiated on the liberal dimension, because my argument is that is not enough, right? So you may score high there, but it really depends. Your commitment really depends on what you score on the other dimensions. And so yes, there are a few anti-democrats, but I think there are quite a few people in the sample who are less exclusively committed to liberal democratic norms once you start offering them additional dimensions. And I think that kind of ultimately weakens, in an empirical sense and in a normative sense also, the extent to which we can consider them to be committed to liberal democracy. Then when it comes to the mechanisms, so the question of, is it about recognizing that it's something else, wanting something else, and so what you basically described as this bleaker interpretation, is it really about not being committed to liberal democratic norms, or is it about not understanding? And that's one of the things that we want to look at really explicitly in this new project, the two potential pathways towards tolerance, right? And it can be an actual preference for an alternative to liberal democracy, and that indeed is kind of normatively, politically speaking, very much concerning. Or is it about an indifference? Because one of the findings, of course, also from the focus groups in the book, is that sometimes there actually aren't strong views on democracy, right? It's really more of a sense that, we thought it would deliver more. It's not really delivering what we thought it would. And so there's a bit of a lack of clarity on how desirable is democracy really, if it's not really doing what we hoped for it to do. And then the last point on the conjoint, so I didn't kind of delve too much into this, and I don't think we do so in the book, or I do so in the book, but we do so in the BJPS appendix, basically, where because in the Polish conjoint we did have the partisanship included, so we could have these direct trade-offs between the overlap and the non-overlap. And one thing that we found there when we dug a little bit deeper is that when it comes to actually defecting from one's preferred partisan candidate, this is something that happens much more on the left than it does on the right. Which is also interesting, because in a way it confirms a little bit what Milan Svolik also argues, backsliding kind of happens on the right, because that's where you say, I'm going to continue voting for this person even if they openly violate democracy. And I think what's interesting in the Polish context as opposed to the US context is that there would be ideologically proximate alternatives, and yet most PiS supporters would stick with PiS even when they start violating democracy. Whereas on the left, where we have arguably more leftist coalitions, but still, they would actually defect to another party from the left camp. And I think this is something that we may expect to see more strongly in multi-party settings than in really these bipolar, as we have it in the US. But that's why I also think that this partisan polarization argument travels less plausibly to multi-party settings because we do have these ideologically more proximate alternatives that voters can defect to if their preferred candidate violates democracy. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, we will now move to the Q&A from our audience. We have a few questions lined up for you both. Okay, let me see here. They are in the Q&A box for you both to see, but I'll read them out loud anyway, for the sake of YouTube. So, first of all, we have, thank you for this excellent presentation. Does the author think she would find the same results in Western Europe, or does this cultural explanation suggest that the less established Central and Eastern European democracies are more at risk of backsliding?
Thank you very much. That's really an excellent question, and having asked myself this question is really what drove me to want to do this this follow-up project. Because what I wouldn't want is for the book to be read as basically a Western European kind of coming in and saying, oh, you know, these post-communist citizens, they just haven't understood democracy sufficiently well, and therefore they're not able to respond. I actually think that we're massively overestimating citizen support for liberal democracy also in Western European context, and that this is one of the things that I expect to be driving votes for kind of illiberal far-right parties. So I think I would probably expect a lower degree of confusion, as in kind of indifferent responses, but I would definitely expect a similar extent of weak liberals that are also looking at other things. And yeah, so I do think there's something to be said about this argument traveling beyond the post-communist context. I'll know more in a couple of years' time when I've collected the data.
Nice. Well, again, with the crystal ball into the future, there are elections in Hungary in April 2026. What would you predict following the results you have? Maybe the results you will get.
So I just got back actually from Budapest. I was there last week giving a talk about this book. And I think one very interesting difference between the Polish and the Hungarian opposition strategy is the extent to which the opposition appeals to democracy and explicitly says that, uses this as an electoral appeal. And in the Polish context, this was very much something that the former opposition party Civic Platform did, saying, you know, if you vote for us, we will come into office, and within 100 days, we will restore the rule of law. Now, it turned out that was somewhat less easy than they foresaw when they took office, but it was very much kind of the electoral competition was very much around this issue. In Hungary, it's very different because the candidate that currently is actually polling ahead of Orbán and has been so rather consistently, and we see also in Orbán's response that he's pretty afraid, that even with all of the tilting of the electoral playing field, he still doesn't seem to be coming out on top for now. So he's just bought the last remaining independent newspaper. So there's obviously some effort going on at reframing things through the media. But what is interesting there is, first of all, the opposition candidate is from Fidesz, so it's kind of a splinter party that previously he was part of the backsliding party, and that he speaks much less directly about democracy. So he speaks about corruption, but I would say as a bit more of a valence issue. So if he comes in, then he would be kind of less corrupt. And he speaks a lot about the economy. So we see a very different electoral appeal. And what's interesting is that this seems to be working out, right? So it's, for now, this is an appeal that convinces the voters, maybe even more so than the previous opposition candidate that was endorsed by 7 different opposition parties across the ideological spectrum that very much made an appeal around democracy, but failed in 2022 to win the elections. So on paper, it's looking like the opposition leader could win. The question is, if and when he does, how much he would be able to roll back what Fidesz has done. Because what PiS did is a lot of legal changes, kind of writing different backsliding measures into law. And this is proving hard enough for the opposition to roll back. What Fidesz did, of course, is one step further, because they had a two-thirds majority, is writing these changes into the constitution. And this is definitely not something that's going to happen. So the opposition candidate will not gain a two-thirds majority. So they will come into a new system if they win the election that is fundamentally skewed already, and where I think it will be very hard to roll back what has happened under Fidesz.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question here from Dimitri. Does this kind of multidimensional analysis of democratic attitudes make Pippa Norris's critical democrats framework, whose measurements are somewhat more simplistic, less relevant? He's asking because in his current work, he finds that critical democratic attitudes are linked to political behaviour, particularly protest participation during periods of democratic backsliding. And of course, Chris as well, feel free to answer as well, as Natasha.
Yeah, so I think this is a framework that I want to look into a little bit more now with a new project, because there's really more of this idea that as democracy becomes more consolidated, understandings shift from some degree of confusion towards more kind of instrumental democratic support, supporting democracy for its outcomes, towards a really kind of procedural support that is very much clear-cut and enlightened in a way, where citizens are more critical because they understand better. Now, I do think, and I have spoken to Pippa Norris about including majoritarian items. She didn't buy it at the time. I'm thinking maybe now she reads the book, maybe she'll be a bit more inclined. But I know that they have been thinking about expanding the item battery that they use, because they have liberal items, redistributive items, and then authoritarian items, but where I would say they're a bit kind of post-Cold War items. So it's about, what do you think about military rule? What do you think about the church being in charge? So not something that would immediately appeal, let's say, to European citizens. So I do think that the multidimensionality is something that my framework adds, that I think we actually need to understand what citizens really think and how this motivates their electoral behavior.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And then, well, we have one other question for you. What follows from these results? What should be done? If weak liberals and indifferent citizens are the majority in Hungary and Poland, is the EU's strong push for liberal democracy an effective strategy? Shouldn't the EU or mainstream discourse show more understanding towards different understandings of democracy? How can this be done without encouraging further backsliding?
So I think, to me, this very much depends on the extent to which different understandings are compatible with liberal democracy. So I think the EU should definitely not back away from a liberal democratic understanding. I do think, though, that a stronger redistributive understanding, especially in kind of economically tense context that we're living now, is understandable. That citizens at the end of the month look at their account, can they put money on, can they put food on the table, and how is that looking? I think that is perfectly legitimate, and this is also something to be recognized in liberal democracies, that when they no longer deliver on the outcomes, and I think we see it very similarly also in with the refugee crisis, that threats can be very easily mobilized in order to undermine democratic support, be they internal economically or external, with kind of increasing multicultural societies and kind of all of the scaremongering that far-right parties do around this. I don't think the EU should cave into what I see as really deliberate appeals to reframe democracy as something that at least liberal democracy is not, in order to understand. I think, on the contrary, and I think we see this a little bit also in I've done some work on the European Parliament on how MEPs speak about liberal democracy, that the fact that there have been these very clear and somewhat also effective attempts by far-right MEPs to frame democracy as something else and to push back against EU criticism, have also pushed mainstream parties to say, but why is liberal democracy important, and what is it about liberal democracy? It's not just about rules, it's really also about the way we treat losers, the way we deal with key institutional safeguards. And I don't think it would be helpful to go back on that. Maybe one last thought, what can be done instead? I think we need much more vocal explanations, both at the kind of like political education, so the more socialization basis, but also in everyday discourse, as to why do these movements pose threats to liberal democracy, and why is this something that citizens should be concerned about?
Absolutely. Well, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That does bring us to time. We're just under the hour, which is fantastic. And what an interesting conversation to be a part of, with some really great questions at the end there as well. Thank you so much, Christopher. Thank you so much, Natasha. It's really wonderful to learn from you both today. And well, for anyone that would like to rewatch parts of today, or indeed share it with your colleagues, peers that would find this interesting as well, it will be on our EU Values website in a couple of days, and also on our YouTube channel. So we'll put everything there with links to everything that's been discussed today. And well, thank you on behalf of the EU Values Network. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thanks a lot, Chris.
You're welcome. Thanks, everyone.